You are looking live.
Here comes the play. Goodman at the free throw line. Jumper.
He broke his ankles. He is Houdini.
Mickey Mantle don't care about you, so why should you care about him? Nobody cares.
That's not a good call. No.
You don't like that call.
I don't like that call.
Woo, 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 woo. Not so fast.
As I said, this segment we're going to be getting to Cincinnati and whether they have a real shot at success once they join the Big 12. Again, this is primarily for football. Something I forgot to address last week in the BYU segment. Somebody said, is football really the only sport that matters? And I was like, no, that is a decent point, and I forgot to kind of address that. This is focused on football right now because it is football season. I will be getting to basketball, but I mean, I'm not going to be talking about college basketball before the season really starts. I want to keep kind of things relevant. Same way I wouldn't be talking about, like if I was doing this in the summer, I would kind of I'd maybe be looking at baseball or whatever, right? So I kind of want to keep it relevant with what season is going on. So I'm not basketball is my favorite sport. I'm not, I'm not putting that, I'm not throwing that away. I know that basketball is important to these conferences as well, but this is focused more on football because it is football season. So that was one important aspect of the segment that I forgot to address last week. And so Cincinnati is one of the better teams out of the four new Big 12 teams against Power 5 over the last 18 years, and even in recent history, last 6 years. Since 2003, Cincinnati is an even 40-40, a 50% winning percentage against Power 5 teams. However, since 2015, they are 7-3 against Power 5 teams, which you can look at that one of two ways. You can look at it like, wow, that's great. They're 7-3 against Power 5. And that's fair, right? I mean, 7-3 is a great win percentage, but for there only to be 10 games against Power 5 in 6 years, I don't, and a good handful of those were against bowl teams, or I'm sorry, not against bowl teams, in bowl games. So like 2020 last year, their only Power 5 game was against Georgia, which was a bowl game. 2018, they played Virginia Tech in a bowl. 2014, they played Virginia Tech in a bowl again. 2013, North Carolina in a bowl. So, like, they don't schedule a lot of Power 5 teams as it is, and then, they get one in a bowl game if they're lucky. So, and the reason that they played a lot more games against Power 5, and this is current Power 5, right? So that means Louisville and West Virginia and all those teams that were in American Athletic Conference or Big East, as it was known before, right? Because Cincinnati was in that conference with those teams, so they played them constantly every year. But they haven't played a lot of Power 5 teams over the past 6 years, and even past, if you want to look at past 7 years, 8 years, same kind of principle applies. As soon as Syracuse, Pitt, Louisville went to the ACC, Rutgers to the Big 10, and West Virginia to the Big 12. I'm sorry, Big 12. Ever since those teams kind of split, Cincinnati has not had a lot of games against Power 5 because they didn't go and split with the rest of those teams. So for me to really consider them to be like a big threat in the Big 12, like in the future, like this year, if they're in the Big 12 this year, like they might win the Big 12. They probably would be a front runner. But I'm looking into the future when they're actually going to be in the Big 12, right? We can talk about the ifs and buts all day. If they're in the Big 12 now, but they beat Notre Dame, or like, yes, that's great, right? That's big round of applause. But I'm really looking at the future when it's really going to matter, when they're actually in the Big 12, right? So for me to like really sit back and say, oh my goodness, Cincinnati might be the new Oklahoma in the Big 12, I really wish they would have played more games against Power 5 in recent history for me to say, wow, like, okay, this is something that they can sustain over a over a long period of time and over a 5 or 6 game stretch. But that just isn't here just yet. So like Power 5 as a whole is pretty decent, but again, that's because a large bulk of their games came against West Virginia, Syracuse, Louisville, Pittsburgh, and Rutgers, and West Virginia. I'm not sure if I mentioned West Virginia, because they were all in the same conference. And again, that's another thing. You can take that one of two ways. You can say, well, when they are conference opponents with Power 5, and they're constantly preparing for them, they can beat them, right? You might say, okay, well, that just shows that they have what it takes to beat Power 5 teams when they are in a schedule, in a conference regular season schedule with them, which is not something that we were able to look at with BYU. And that's a fair argument, right? Cincinnati, had really good years with the Big East / American Athletic. More specifically, 2008 and 2009 were really good years. They even played some other teams as well where they were able to win. But so like I said, you can take that one of two ways. You can say that, well, they can only beat Power 5 when they're in a conference with them. And that's really the only takeaway, but you can kind of, there's one way to word it and one way to one takeaway, but you can think about that one of two ways. You can think of that as a good thing or a bad thing. Because, the good way is, wow, if they're in a conference with Power 5 teams, and the other thing is, at the time, that they were not Power 5 teams when they were playing the West Virginia and those teams that I listed. But again, they're Power 5 right now, so that's really what matters. And it's kind of just a really odd thing, just a weird, how they transitioned into Power 5 teams. And to take a look back at it, it's kind of odd to say, well, do you consider them Power 5 or not? I do, because of what they are considered currently. So, you can say, wow, when they're playing them constantly, they do well. Or you say, well, they can really only beat them when they're playing them all the time. And even that, to take that negatively isn't even a horrible thing to say. Oh my God, they can only beat them when they're playing them all the time. Okay, that's fine. However, when take Power 5, kind of take that one step further, look at top 25. Now, this is, again, top 25 at the time they played them over the years. Since 2003, they're 16-27 against top 25 teams, a win percentage of 37.2. Since 2015, they're 5-10 against top 25, and that is including their most recent win over Notre Dame last week, which brings them up to a 33.3% win percentage. So, and you might say, okay, well, who were the 5 teams that they beaten? 5 teams, top 525 teams. A lot of 5s being thrown around here. Notre Dame, right? This year. 2020, you had Tulsa, SMU, and Army. 2 of them are conference opponents, and none of them are Power 5. They beat those 3 teams last year. They lose to Georgia in the bowl game. 2019, they lose both games to Memphis. One was the regular season, one was the conference championship. 2019, they also get embarrassed against Ohio State. UCF has 2-0 against them, 2017 and 18. I saw UCF and USF, and I don't know why, but my mind just kind of blended them together. But they played 8th ranked Michigan in 2017. They lose that one by a big margin. Houston in 2016, they lose that by a big margin. So, and the teams they beat, Army was ranked 22nd, SMU 16th, Tulsa 23rd. Notre Dame, ranked 9th last week, is the highest ranked team that they've beaten since 2009 when they beat 15th ranked Pittsburgh. So, you can look at, again, this is another one you can look at one of two ways. You can look at it as, they can't beat really good top 25 teams, which over recent history, it would be proven true, except for the one game last week, which would kind of be an outlier. Or you could look at it as this year is a great year for Cincinnati, and I won't debate you on that at all, right? They're a 5th ranked team in the country. They're looking good. And you might say, okay, well, hey, they're turning things around, and I wouldn't argue with that. Right? Of course they're turning things around. They're undefeated, they're top 5. They beat some pretty good teams, or some pretty decent teams this year. And you might say, well, they're going to take that and they're going to take that momentum into the Big 12. And I wouldn't discourage that thought or that take, but I have a hard time like standing up and saying, yeah, they're going to dominate in the Big 12 because they beat Notre Dame this year, right? There's a lack of evidence to go. There's a lack of evidence to support that claim, right? And there's a decent amount of evidence to support the claim that, well, all right, sure, they can hang with Power 5 teams, but top 25 team is a whole nother battle, right? And again, maybe this is where they turn things around. Maybe this year is a huge turning point for the Cincinnati Bearcat football franchise, right? I mean, who knows what could happen, right? Anything can happen. But it is concerning that they are 0-2 against BYU since 2015, and they're only 2-3 against UCF since 2015. Against current Big 12 teams, including Texas and Oklahoma, they haven't played anybody from the Big 12 since 2011, and since 2003, they're only 2-6. Against the future Big 12, excluding, Texas and Oklahoma, they're 3-9. Last game in 2011 against West Virginia, and West Virginia is the only future Big 12 team that they've played. So there is not a lot to look at and say, well, look, they've done well against Texas Tech or Oklahoma State or TCU or Baylor or Iowa State or Kansas State or anything like that. Like, there's not, because they haven't played any of those teams since 2003. And sure, I mean, if you want to go back to the 90s or the 80s or the 70s and say, well, no, they beat them in the 70s. Like, okay, that's great. But that happened, 40, 50 years ago. I don't know how that really transfers to current day. Like, I was talking about this with some family members, and, one of them said, well, Holy Cross had a Heisman finalist in I think the 87 was it, I believe. Does that mean that we think Holy Cross, and Holy Cross isn't even in Division I right now for football, FBS. So are we just going to say that Holy Cross should be in, right? And sure, like, you did something great in the 70s or 80s, like, okay, that's really good. That's great for your program's history and everything. But where's the relevance to today? Where does that connect to today? I don't see it, right? And sure, you might say, well, you wouldn't say the same thing about world history, right? And it's like, well, world history is a whole different battle than college football, all right? Like, let's not be comparing carrots to apples here. You know what I'm saying? Like, forget oranges to apples. This is like steak and potatoes to apples. Like, it's just not, no correlation there. So, like, that was an interesting argument made. And, so I just, Cincinnati, sure, they're having a great year this year, but, and hey, if they can carry that into next year and the year after that, and the years that they enter the Big 12, great. That's awesome. And we're going to see a better competition for the Big 12. And, the same goes for BYU. And maybe I was a little too harsh on BYU, but, like, I don't know. Cincinnati has, like, I feel like Cincinnati has more going in their favor this year, and in the past few years than BYU. Especially because Cincinnati is already in a conference, so they're used to that kind of structure as to how things go, where BYU is an independent school, so they just kind of schedule whoever they want, right? Like, last year they scheduled some teams that I never even heard of. Like, I think it was like Northern Alabama or something. Like, I didn't even know that was a team. So, like, BYU kind of has that leisure to schedule whoever they want, and they're not restricted to a conference schedule, where Cincinnati is more used to how that works and used to that structure. So for that reason, and for what I've brought forth, they've had success against Power 5 over recent years, regardless of how many games it is, they've had success. Top 25 is a different battle, but they look like they're getting, they're going in the right direction. So, I think out of any of the teams, Cincinnati is the front runner to who has the best chance of having success in the Big 12. BYU is second in football, but I think BYU just does. I think Cincinnati has the advantage because of having the better season this year. Like, if you compared Cincinnati and BYU this season, I would take Cincinnati all day long. And also, as I said, Cincinnati is used to that conference structure. Way more. Like, the last time BYU was in a conference was when they were, was it Mountain West with TCU and Utah back in the early 2000s? Like that, that was 15, 18, 20 years ago. So, and Cincinnati has always been in a structured conference, whether it's a weak conference or not. They're just used to how that goes, and so I think that's just an added advantage that maybe a lot of people don't think about. So take that as you may. I'm sure that it depends on how the Cincinnati fans are. I know BYU fans were not particularly pleased with my thoughts on BYU. So hopefully the Cincinnati fans are more willing to level and reason with me than the fans out in Utah for BYU. So those are just kind of my takeaways as to what I've seen in the past years, in recent years, and how I think that will transition to Cincinnati entering the Big 12 in 2020. Can somebody give me, everybody's getting mad at me, and to be fair, I probably should know this by now, but can somebody tell me when these teams are actually joining? Because, to be honest, I don't really know. I've seen so many different things. I've seen 2023, 2025, 2024. Maybe I saw one report that said maybe even next year. So I really don't know. And I'd love for somebody who knows for sure to say, hey, this is the year, right? Because then I can really start saying, okay, well, if it really is next year, then wow, maybe Cincinnati and BYU have more of a chance than I thought. If it's 5 years from now, okay, then anything can happen, right? Things can